have that many solutions for brain degeneration or really brain protection. So in the medical model, you might get end-stage disease and be applied different drugs or different pharmaceuticals for your degeneration. And maybe you know about a few conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and of course dementia as the overall umbrella. So today I'll go ahead and explore different ways that the brain can really degenerate. We'll talk about a lot of different things that may be foreign to you, but hopefully it will empower you guys to take a preventive role in your health. Okay. We know about 1 in 8 seniors now have Alzheimer's, and we spend about $200 billion per year on treatment, and also from caregivers. We have about 25 million people that are diabetic. We have a surge in heart disease, a number of people that have cancer. So chronic disease is really affecting many people. But the consistency behind every chronic disease, with what I just mentioned, is there's a consequence on brain. And of course, it would be ideal for all of you guys to really help your brain out because you're enduring the wonderful world of public speaking and Toastmasters. Okay. So dementia is just kind of an overall term we use, and maybe you've heard about that. Have you guys heard about dementia or Alzheimer's? Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, in fact about 70%. And then you have vascular dementia afterwards. And dementia just encompasses loss of memory, concentration, visual perception, people that perhaps can't really motivate anymore. And technically we apply this term to people in older age, 50s, 60s, and surely 70s and 80s. And of course a high percentage of people will get this in their 80s and 90s. But again, we're seeing more and more people at an earlier age start to really degenerate. And these are simple things like you lose your keys, you can't remember things, like I'm doing right now. And these are subtle findings that you can really go ahead and work on by doing supplementation, by doing dietary changes, by doing stress reduction strategies. And of course, last or 2 weekends ago, we heard about techniques to filter water, and we had a 20-minute presentation from someone else. So there's a lot of different ways I'll go through. First and foremost, I'm hoping I have enough handouts here. This is a form. Can you pass that around? This is a form that can actually go ahead and detect early brain degeneration. So I use this form with a number of my patients. And of course, if you don't know, my background is chiropractic. I'm more of a wellness practitioner with a focus on nutritional therapy as well. So I use this form in my clinic. And it really goes into detail with a number of different categories. And we'll take maybe a couple minutes just to tell you what each category is. And the fun thing about this is you can actually go ahead and use it at home, fill it out. It's very subjective, but you can really see where you're maybe not performing the best. So we'll kind of take it category by category. And now, I should mention, the tough thing is when it comes to brain health, there's really nothing to really detect any kind of pathology. So we can't really detect neurotransmitters in the brain. We can do a urinary test, but it's not completely objective. So we have to resort to like an MRI, maybe a CT, a SPECT scan, but those will cost thousands of dollars. So we use this form, and you guys can kind of go up and down. You don't have to fill it out right now, but you can do it at home. It's on a subjective scale, 0, 1, 2, and 3. And 3 means it really pertains to you, it really impacts your life, whereas 0, it doesn't really apply to you, and you can just go ahead and skip it, and you're fine in that category. So I'll just kind of outline all the different categories. Section 1 is brain circulation, and you guys can maybe jot these down for later on if you want to fill this whole thing out. Section 2 is basically low blood sugar. And I'll kind of talk about these categories in specific here in a few minutes. Category 3 or section 3 is high blood sugar. Section 4 is stress and the brain. Section 5 is fatty acids or healthy fats. Okay. Section 6 is brain-gut axis. And it seems like a really big term, but brain-gut. There's a bidirectional connection between brain and gut and brain. So basically what you eat can potentially affect your brain, Lawrence just talked about. Section 7 is brain immune axis. Okay. Section 8 is a big one I'll go ahead and touch on later on, is gluten digestion. And then section 9 is, maybe you've heard about this term, gut permeability or intestinal barrier. Okay. And then section 10 is, now we're getting into specific neurotransmitters, which are basically chemicals in the brain that communicate from one neuron to another, is serotonin. And section 11 is dopamine. I should probably go ahead and spell these out for you later on. But section 12 is acetylcholine. And then section 13 is catecholamines. And I'll talk about each and every one, but I'll hit on the first 4. And then section 14 is GABA. Okay? So let me go ahead and break down section 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'll touch on section 8. I really don't have time for every section right now. It would take me like an hour or an hour and a half. So let me go ahead and start out with section 1. And let's see. You guys? I guess I can use that too. Okay. Okay, so section 1 is looking at blood circulation, endurance. And this is a really big thing because people that have changes in blood pressure, either low or high, can potentially damage their brain. And vascular integrity, like I mentioned before, is the second source of dementia, about 15 to 20% of people. It really degenerates over time. So what we see with vessels as we age, and again, it may be people in their 20s or 30s, but probably most people in their 50s or 60s or 70s. Blood flow velocity will actually decrease. The dilation of vessels will be reduced. And of course, we have certain compounds to kind of apply therapy for these different issues. And we also have a buildup in plaquing. So it's really critical to go ahead and assess blood pressure, number 1. But a really big thing when it comes to blood vessel health and circulation is some of the symptoms in here that you can actually look at. So if people are getting cold hands and feet, it may be diagnostic for improper blood flow. Because keep in mind that the brain is the most north region, and we have to go ahead and fight against gravity. So if you're not really perfusing your hands and feet, and they're cold all the time, like you have to wear socks, you're probably not getting blood to brain as well, and also your kidneys. And this is really common with people that have blood pressure like 90 over 60 or 80 over 50. And they go to their medical doctors and they might hear, well, your blood pressure is fantastic. Because normal blood pressure is about 120 over 80. But keep in mind, they may not be getting adequate blood to brain. And also understand that blood carries what? Nutrients, neurotransmitters, oxygen, pretty much everything we need for us to do speeches and endure every day and really motivate and think and remember, things like that. So brain circulation is number 1. And we talked about blood pressure. Again, optimal is about 120 over 80. And you're looking for things like cold hands and feet. Maybe your nails aren't growing that fast. Sometimes patients of mine have like fungal overgrowth in their hands just because they can't really drive in adequate immune cells to their distal extremities. Another thing might be cold nose, okay? And you can also look into like a pulse oximeter. So maybe you've heard about that, but you can actually buy one at like Rite Aid or like a medical supply store, and it gives you an idea of pulse, and then also how much oxygen is going to your hands and feet. So you would actually go ahead and tie it up, and you should have oxygen saturation of about 98, 99. So O2 sat levels, 98 plus, okay? And, okay. Another thing that you can understand is people that really fatigue after maybe doing a speech, or maybe driving, maybe reading for 10 to 15 minutes, that's an endurance issue, and it might be blood flow. So again, you have to resort to some of the things I mentioned and really go and apply different strategies, which I'll talk about later on. So that's number one, blood flow, circulation. Number two is sugar. Can you guys see this okay, or should I write bigger? Good? From all, okay. So section 2 and section 3 are kind of tied together. And you guys may be looking at some of the questions which are technically symptoms of either low blood sugar or high blood sugar. Now section 2, and I see patients like this all the time, but these are individuals that skip meals, okay? So they might wake up in the morning, skip breakfast, depend on coffee, get like maybe a muffin or a high glycemic index snack to spike their blood sugar. And these are also people that get irritable, lightheaded, dizzy, have headaches, and they get fatigued throughout the day. So they have low blood sugar, and you can see some of the symptoms in section 2. They also might have trouble sleeping. Man, that's cold. Okay, so an easy fix for this I'll talk about later on, but for the most part, you just have to go ahead and regulate your blood sugar. Okay, by having meals every hour and a half or 2 hours, and having adequate protein, carbohydrates, and healthy fats. And I'll talk about some of the details here in a minute. Now section 3, section 3 is on the other end, is high blood sugar. So we have low versus high. Now you probably heard about diabetes and high blood sugar, or hyperglycemia. It's a huge problem. And it's actually interesting, in my research, you don't find that many people with diabetes in primitive tribes around the world. So if they're still eating, like you mentioned, a paleo diet or ancestral food, which is pretty clean as opposed to everything processed in cans and in packages here in the supermarkets, they just don't get diabetes, and their blood sugar is controlled pretty well. So these are people all over the world that aren't exposed to the Western model of our dietary habits. Because right now about 25 million people are diagnosed with diabetes. And there's another, I would say 15, 20, or 25 million not even diagnosed. And you can easily find out with a simple blood chemistry pattern or blood chemistry lab by looking at glucose, hemoglobin A1C, okay, that's your long-standing blood sugar marker, and then you might want to get like a basic lipid panel. Okay, I'll write those down. So glucose, and then your hemoglobin, A1C, and then a lipid panel. And that's like cholesterol, triglycerides, LDL, HDL. So that gives you an idea of your blood chemistry and basically your sugar handling. Okay, and I'll talk about different strategies later on. But these people in specific, you can see in section 3, they tend to fatigue after meals. Okay, so think about if you guys have like a high carbohydrate load. I know we've had cakes in here and things like that. If you want to take a nap afterwards, it's pretty diagnostic. You've had too many carbohydrates, and it's a very demanding pathway we take to minimize glucose and excrete it. So it goes into triglycerides, we get very fatigued, and we shouldn't be doing that many carbs overall. Or we should balance with protein and fats, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And these individuals have a hard time losing weight as well. It's not really a weight loss talk, but people that have a high carbohydrate load, certainly 200, 300, 400 grams per day, they have a hard time losing weight. And especially because a lot of these carbohydrates are very refined and modified and even hybridized to where our immune system has no idea what to do with them. So that's more hyperglycemia. And these people also crave sugar, crave sweets, and have to go ahead and have it after a meal. So you may not be fully diabetic, but high blood sugar is enough to kind of warrant an alarm. Okay? And specifically what we see with the brain, let me take this back, is type 3 diabetes is now being called Alzheimer's in the research. So there's a huge influence of sugar and how it becomes glycosylated, a different form in the bloodstream, okay, over time, and how it can lead to brain degeneration. So glucose levels over about 95 and a hemoglobin A1C at about 5.6 is enough to, or should be enough to really modify your diet and start doing things from a preventive model and change your lifestyle. Okay, the next one is stress, and we have that in section 4, so you guys can maybe peek at some of those symptoms or questions. And these are people kind of like myself, very type A, always have projects that have to be completed. You guys ever experience that? Yeah. and they work 40, 50, 60, 70 hours per week. They don't get adequate sleep, and they're stressed out. And this really takes a toll from a physiological perspective. And so maybe go ahead and look at some of these questions, and you can gauge where you're at. 0, 1, 2, or 3. Again, 3 meaning it's very consistent with you. It really affects your body. Now, specifically, stress on the brain, we're looking at one marker. It's called interleukin 6. So it's an inflammatory cytokine, basically a chemical signal that flares up with any kind of stress. Now, the interesting thing is, stress can be emotional, it can be biochemical, like a food sensitivity, or it can be physical. So maybe you're overtraining at the gym, and you've done a little bit too much, you have muscle soreness, you have a huge inflammatory surge afterwards. Public speaking. It's very stressful overall, and we're still getting a surge in interleukin 6. We're getting, maybe you've heard about sympathetic activity, okay, where heart rate increases, trouble with breathing, sweaty palms, things like that. So there's a consequence on brain as well with overall stress. And the 2 areas in the brain that really degenerate the quickest and are linked to Alzheimer's are the memory centers. So the hippocampus, and then short-term memory is more frontal. And that's why we also see trouble with motivation, judgment, personality as we age over time. But the biggest one is the hippocampus. And these are very, very sensitive cells that just can't cope with stress over time. And it really burns out your adrenal gland too. So your adrenals sit right above your kidneys, in your flank area, and they release, maybe you've heard about cortisol, okay, like a stress hormone, deposits belly fat, and then also catecholamines. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, these dump in the bloodstream whenever you're stressed out or have a lack of sleep or maybe an emotional fight with your spouse that can elicit these stress hormones, or even, like I mentioned, overtraining or like a brain injury or a food sensitivity. So there's a lot of different ways you can potentially have these stress hormones elevate in the brain. Okay? Let me skip over now to section 8, actually one of my favorites. Oh my goodness. Come on, yellow. Okay, really quickly, section 8, and you guys can kind of peek at that, but gluten and wheat has really become a really big issue. And I know some of you might think it's kind of a trendy diet for the most part, but there's a lot of truth to it. And gluten overall has been very hybridized. We're essentially looking at 2 different grains, or even 3 different grains, all kind of put together. So technically it's not genetically modified, but it's hybridized. Very, very different than like soy and corn, because those are modified here in America. Gluten has been very processed. They tend to go ahead and deaminate the grains. They store it in bins for about 2 years, where enterotoxins kind of grow on top. And you can actually go ahead and test for this. And about 30% have gluten intolerance. And you find gluten, of course, in breads, in pastas, in crackers, and pretty much everything, because it's a cheap agent to go ahead and bind things together, and it's long shelf life. Okay? So that's number 4. Okay, and then the last one, and if you don't mind, for the sake of this module, maybe give me a few more minutes after red. Okay, the last one is just overall exercise. Now, this is not really on the list, but keep in mind, low exercise, or I should say inadequate exercise per week, has a huge influence on the brain. Or I should say another way, if you exercise a few days a week, 3 to 5 times for about 30 minutes to 45 minutes at a high intensity, we elicit tremendous therapeutic responses. And I'll write down a few. So when exercising at that rate, we have growth hormone release. And growth hormone is all about bone density, muscle mass, really does a lot with what we call brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So this gets elevated, and this protein is in your brain. It's also linked to every kind of neurodegenerative disease at a low level. So like multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and any kind of dementia. This is at a low level. Now, third of all, we see with exercise, insulin sensitivity. So again, going back to blood sugar control and diabetes. With adequate exercise at a high